In this video, you'll discover how to increase your podcast engagement and guarantee more listeners stay hooked on your content. So look, my name is Anthony Winery, and I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping education-based podcasters, business owners, coaches, experts in their field turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing, positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generated $120,000 in profit over the last 9 months. By the end of this video, you'll discover symptoms of low podcast engagement and how it's likely screwing with your show's growth and monetization opportunities in ways you didn't expect. 3 common mistakes that stops listeners from becoming raving fans and paying clients. How to structure episodes that turns listeners into high-ticket clients even if you're just starting out. Proven frameworks for creating authority-building content that positions you as the must-listen-to expert in your niche. The psychology behind proven episodes that keeps listeners engaged until the end and gets them taking action to build a deeper relationship with your brand. So look, before we dive straight into this, I really want to start off by highlighting some warning signs of low podcast engagement and how it might be manifesting in your show and your personal experience and why you shouldn't take it lightly. I'm really sharing this transparently to help you identify whether or not this video is one relevant for you and whether you should invest the next few moments watching this. But more importantly, I guess to really again help you identify again those struggles and to highlight ways that it might be negatively impacting your growth and monetization opportunities. Oftentimes, I work with hundreds of podcasters, and it's very easy to kind of skip over some of these warning signs because you're so close to your own podcast, to creating the content that you might not realize how having low engagement, you might not even know whether you have low engagement. So I want to give you some clear benchmarks to help you qualify yourself to decide whether or not, again, this is worth you kind of binging, going through and applying for yourself. And then, of course, I'll also explain why these issues actually exist and why you need to address them right now. And then later on, I'll be breaking down in very painful detail how to fix these issues forever. So look, what does low podcast engagement actually look like? Firstly, you might get people mentioning how great your episodes are. They might leave comments and tell you how they loved it, but then there's no meaningful follow-up. No one actually books in to speak with your sales team. No one's books in to speak with you. No one's asking about your paid programs, your services, membership, whatever that might be. You might get some of these nice words and comments, but there's no further exploration around working with you specifically. And you might have issues like you might have an initial super high downloads for an episode, but yet again, no one's taking call to action. And better yet, you might realize when you look a bit deeper that you have a low completion rate. Now, a completion rate is the same as a retention time. And for some reason, Apple and Spotify have different verbiage around what this is. But essentially, your completion rate is how much of an episode do your audience consume. So for example, if you have a 60-minute long podcast and listeners consume your content for an average of 30 minutes, it means you have an average completion rate of 50%. Pretty simple maths, right? So if that is the case, it doesn't matter if you're getting thousands of downloads for your podcast. If the majority of people aren't keeping engaged through the content, it's very hard to nurture them effectively. And of course, later on, you see how this downstreamed in terms of you growing the show, in terms of you monetizing the podcast, in terms of you turning listeners into diehard fans, as well as paying clients. Now, these surface level symptoms are actually pointing to a much deeper problem. Your podcast isn't generating you discovery calls or client inquiries. Past guests aren't sharing your episodes, aren't promoting it, and they're also maybe not referring potential clients. And your email list doesn't seem to be growing despite you podcasting consistently. Again, all signs you have low podcast engagement. Now, finally, most podcasters don't realize this. If you're a business owner or an expert or the podcaster looking to launch, this is something to really look out for, right? If you're spending hours creating content that isn't converting into business results, that's a problem, right? If you're watching other competitors with smaller audiences or similar sized audiences generate more clients, more interest, more buzz, that's a problem. If you're missing out on speaking opportunities because your show isn't building that authority, again, that's a problem. These are very clear opportunities that you're missing out on because you haven't got a high podcast engagement rate. These are the downstream effects of, again, having a low podcast engagement rate. Now look, here's the painful irony of the podcasting world. Entrepreneurs with the most valuable expertise often struggle the most to keep listeners engaged. So if you've ever wondered why lighter business podcasts gain massive traction while shows that are packed with genuine experts, the answer has nothing to do with the quality of your content and everything to do with what we're about to discuss. Here's an interesting fact for you. Did you know that an average podcast listener actually loses 60% of listeners in the first few minutes? When I found this out, it blew me away, but I was kind of familiar because I've heard about, whether that's TikTok brain that people talk about, whether that's just on YouTube. I know that for most pieces of content, there's a high drop off in terms of people losing engagement. But why should you care, right? Well, look, with thousands of podcasts and shows that are out there constantly competing for attention, every unfinished episode presents lost opportunity for you to, number one, position yourself as a go-to expert in your niche. Number two, convert listeners into high-ticket clients. Number three, build authority that attracts speaking gigs, partnership opportunities, essentially more monetization opportunities to you, whatever that looks like. And then finally, generate the kind of word of mouth that accelerates real business growth. And if you're investing, and the likelihood is you're probably investing a bunch of time, a bunch of energy into podcasting, this isn't about the tactics. It's really more about the fear that you're putting yourself out there only to be ignored, only to be, kind of washed over, to be looked over, worried that your own expertise isn't being valued, and having this nagging feeling that, hey, look, I'm spending all this time, all this hours, all this energy, and probably a lot of money as well, doing this podcasting thing, doing this whole content game, but it's not bringing you a real ROI. And look, here's the thing. While other business owners are landing clients, speaking gigs through their podcast, most entrepreneurs are unknowingly creating content that listeners start but never finish, leaving them wondering why their great content, quote unquote great content, isn't translating into an engaged, growing audience with business results. You're either designing a message that resonates and creates loyalty, or allowing random conversations to dilute your influence. The difference between a professional and an amateur is strategy. Professionals create value by being deliberate. Amateurs hope they get lucky. That is the reality of the space we're in. And there's a reason why so many of the podcast advice that you listen to that everyone seems to follow leads them to disappointing results. Following the crowd is keeping you stuck in the crowd. So before you record another hour recording content that gets ignored by dream clients, let's explore 3 mistakes that even experienced entrepreneurs and experts make that keeps their engagement low, and how fixing just one of these could double your podcast impact. So here are 3 common mistakes that stop listeners from becoming raving fans and paying clients. Number 1, information overload in your intros. I see this all day, every day, and this is so common. What this is like serving someone a 7-course meal when they've just asked for a quick lunch. So many podcasters, and I mean so many podcasters, overwhelm their listeners with so much irrelevant information they simply don't care about at the start of the episode. For podcasters, this is essentially them sharing super long, boring guest introduction, taking too long to explain who they are, what they do, why a new or an old listener should stick around to the specific episode. And this completely kills your growth opportunity, because when your episode tries to cover too much, your listeners enter what psychologists call cognitive shutdown. Their brain literally stops processing new information. This means that even your best advice, the insight that you share on the show, that could potentially position you as an expert and attract the high-ticket clients you're looking for, get lost in the noise. The result of this is the overwhelm prevents listeners from taking your advice, turning a potentially transformative episode into background noise. And when listeners associate your show with mental exhaustion, what's the likelihood they return for future episodes? It's unlikely. And if your podcast is unable to get listeners returning to future episodes, what's the likelihood you nurture them correctly? Unlikely. And if you aren't able to nurture listeners properly, what are the chances you turn a listener who, again, could be the right ICP, could be the exact person you're looking for, what's the chance you convince them to become a paying client? basically impossible. So again, just showing you some areas about how, like, you might think, oh, it's nothing, if I just get enough volume. No. This is so important. It goes way more than just like volume and downloads. Downloads are great, but if your audience aren't engaged, if they're not listening and consume your content all the way to the end, it's going to be very hard for you to make any type of income at all. So on to the next one. Mistake number 2, the meandering path syndrome. Now here's what this looks like. A business owner, this is a fancy way of saying the podcast just waffles, right? So imagine you have a business podcast where the host starts by sharing their morning routine. Then they jump to a client story. Then they suddenly shift to marketing tips. Then circle back to finish with a client story 20 minutes later. They look at their analytics and they're puzzled as to why 70% of listeners drop off by 15 minutes on an hour-long show. The episode structure resembles a maze when listeners are looking for a simple, clear path to their destination. It's like giving someone directions to your office by describing every possible route instead of the best one. That is a problem. Now, why this destroys engagement? Because look, each time your episode takes an unexpected turns, you force your listeners to make a decision of whether should I keep listening and hope this connects back to what I care about. And again, this all happens subconsciously. And researchers have shown that a mental energy required to follow a scattered episode actually prevents listeners from taking action on your advice. So even if they finish listening, they're too again mentally exhausted to reach out about your services. And finally, mistake number 3, the lack of strategic tension and anticipation throughout your episodes. Now, what do I mean? Most podcasters will focus solely on delivering information, but then they ignore the psychological principles that keeps people engaged. It's like writing a movie without any plot twist or character development. Yet, technically, things are completed, but it's emotionally unfulfilling. Now, why this prevents growth is because without what we call strategic tension in your episodes, you're missing the psychological triggers that turn someone from a passive listener into an action taker. It's why listeners can think your content is great, but never implement it or never reach out to work with you. The harsh reality is, being informative isn't enough. Without momentum, your expertise once again becomes background noise to your ideal client's day. So a quick recap. We've covered so far warning signs of low podcast engagement and unexpected consequences. We've outlined why information overload kills engagement, how poor episode structure loses listeners, and why missing momentum prevents deeper connections with your audience. Now that you understand what's been sabotaging your growth, let's flip the script and turn these challenges into more opportunities for you. Rather than reinventing the wheel every single time you hit record, imagine having a proven system, one that guarantees high listener engagement, leads to more listeners following you on social media, inspires listeners to binge your content and reach out about your service. The best part about this is you can start using this in your next episodes and literally watch as things change up for you. So in this section, you're about to discover proven frameworks for creating highly engaging content that positions you as a must-listen to expert in your niche and attracts dream clients to your business, and the psychology behind episodes that keeps listeners engaged until the very end and gets them taking consistent action to build a deeper relationship with your brand. Step number 1, opening hook design. Look, your first 30 seconds, as I'm sure you're very aware, you've probably heard this either from myself or a different creator or someone else. It doesn't matter if it's long form, short form, written, spoken, video, audio. The first 30 seconds of any piece of content is super important. Your episode's first 30 seconds determines whether or not someone becomes a loyal listener or whether or not they click away. This step is about crafting an opening that makes it impossible for your ideal clients not to keep listening. Think of it as creating a can't look away moment that speaks to your audience's biggest challenges. This is how you grab their attention. Because the entire goal of your hook is to demand the attention of your listeners as soon as they hit play and show them why they can't afford not to listen to the entire episode. We accomplish this by breaking the expected podcast opening pattern. So what do I mean and what does it look like? For most podcasts, they start off with, hey, welcome back to another episode. But instead, you can start with, stop what you're doing. This weird framework made one of my clients $50,000 just this week, and you can too. You see how those are vastly different openings. One just feels like, again, your reptilian brain just switches off. You're not really paying much attention. The other one commands that you actually pay attention. Stop what you're doing. This weird framework. And again, I'm going to go through what makes a good hook, what makes it all works in just a moment. But you can really see the night and day difference. Now look, relevancy plus curiosity must be baked within your hooks to act as emotional triggers that grabs the listener's attention, keeps them engaged, and gets them eager to listen to the entire episode. Here are 7 powerful frameworks you can start using today to guarantee you hook your listeners and turn new and old listeners into die-hard fans. The first, common wisdom versus reality hook. This is an example of what it looks like. Everyone says LinkedIn is the best way to get clients. But what if your ideal clients are actually avoiding LinkedIn? Here's what the data shows. So again, you can see the common wisdom. Everyone thinks this versus reality. But what if is actually leading to this outcome you weren't expecting? Here's what the data shows. Next hook, the what if hook. Again, these are super simple. You can start applying them right away. What if everything you've been taught about growing your email list is actually pushing away your highest ticket clients? Again, you see the difference. What if? And then you pose a curiosity question. The next one, costly mistake. There are 3 expensive mistakes costing coaches thousands in lost revenue, and most don't realize they're making them until it's too late. Next, unexpected statistic hook. The unexpected statistic hook. That was painful. Which literally sounds like this. 93% of business owners are focusing on the wrong social media platform. And I can prove it with data from our last 100 clients. The next one. By the end of this episode, this is my favorite by the way. By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly how to turn your expertise into a 10K per month recurring revenue stream. Here's why most experts get this wrong. Again, it's really just saying at the end of this, giving someone a promise. The point is here, you're constantly giving people promises, okay? The next one. Upcoming revelation hook. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to share 3 client attraction methods that worked in 2023 but will backfire badly in 2024. Next, unexpected solutions hook. The best way to grow your podcast isn't what you think. In fact, it's the opposite of what most gurus teach. So the point here is, with all these hooks that we've broken down, it doesn't really matter which one you use. You need to use them, and you need to make sure you demand the attention of your listeners as soon as they hit play. Give them a promise, build curiosity, and make the hook relevant to them. Of course, these are all about making money and, podcasts, etc. But for you, it'll be something different. So make these relevant to yourself. Step number 2, content pacing. So content pacing is the art of maintaining the attention throughout your episode. Just like a great Netflix series keeps you watching through strategic storytelling, your podcast needs to create a rhythm that keeps your listeners engaged. This steps shows you how to structure your content so each section naturally leads to the next. Here's how to structure your episodes so potential clients stay engaged from start to finish, eager to learn more about working with you. We'll start with 2 frameworks that can be applied for both solo and interview-based show. Then I'll give you a structure that you can consistently use to create highly engaging episodes. Then we'll share smaller but impactful tactics that you can use within the episode to keep engagement high as you execute on the strategy. It's kind of like getting the blueprints to a house first and then getting the pro tips to decorate it in a way that everyone wants to visit. So episode framework 1, we have the story, point, action framework. So here's how it goes. You start off by sharing a relatable story, then you move to the point that explains the takeaways or the lessons from that story. And then of course you go to the action. Now, again, these frameworks are going to be so simple. However, it gives you that clear structure that your audience can follow along with. So an example here would be, when I first launched my podcast, I made a huge mistake. The point is, the mistake was overloading my information with too much information. Action. Start outlining each episode into 3 simple chunks: intro, value-packed core, and clear CTA. Again, this gives you an example of what structure might look like. And it's really important that you have these structures in place to, again, keep your retention time high and understand the rhythm of your episodes. Episode framework 2, problem, agitate, solution. Problem, highlight a listener pain point. Agitate, add a sense of urgency or emotion to their problem. And then finally, solution, provide a clear solution to make it fixable. So again, these, for example, the problem part, you can take 1 or 2 minutes to explain what the problem is, maybe 5 minutes, but that's probably a bit too long. Agitate, take some time to, again, add why should they care about this problem? Why is it popping up? How is it affecting them? What things is it leading them, what negative effect is this problem having on their life? What opportunities are they missing out on? Really highlighting all those things within the episode and then giving them a clear solution. So this could be a framework you're sharing with them. This could be, a clear action step. This could be an ultimate guide. This can be to book a call to speak with your team about a new program you're launching. Whatever that might be, again, using these simple frameworks will allow you to create episodes that keeps your audience engaged. But more importantly, gets them taking action to explore working with you, working with your team, etc. And lastly, use previews and recaps. So what is it? A preview is a quick overview at the beginning of your episode that tells listeners what they're going to learn or experience. A recap is a summary at the end or a key point that reinforces the main idea or takeaways. Think of this as setting expectations up front and then tying it all together in the end. Now, why this works so well is, imagine, you're walking into a museum without a guide. You'll miss key exhibits or feel lost. But by the way, I don't know about you, but I hate feeling lost. The second thing as well, the preview essentially sets the stage. It shows your listeners, hey, look, here's what's coming next. So they feel excited and prepared. They understand what things to expect, which changes their experience in terms of what they believe they're going to gain from the episode. So with this, having recaps essentially reinforces the key takeaways, acting as mental bookmarks to solidify what they've learned. And if you think about it in terms of this and solidify what they've learned, because here's the thing, people crave structure and distraction, even in conversations. A clear preview makes your content feel like a guided tour while listeners can anticipate the value, while the recap cements their understanding. The second thing that you can do to increase your engagement is to ask more rhetorical questions throughout your episodes. So what is this? Rhetorical questions is essentially a question you ask that doesn't need an actual answer. Instead, it gets your listeners thinking about the topic in a personal way. So for example, ever feel like your podcast is missing that spark? You're promoting them, you're prompting reflection, not asking for a specific response. So why does this work so well? Well, like a conversational ping pong game, rhetorical questions grab the attention of your audience. It invites them to think about their own experience, making them personally way more involved with the actual topics itself. And the insight here is rhetorical questions also break the fourth wall. And between you and your listeners, it creates that sense of intimacy. So for example, if I just stop this right now, I'm going for a presentation, and I stop here and I look at you and say, hey, you right there, how are you doing? Right? That's essentially, well, that's kind of a rhetorical question, not quite. But this really illustrates breaking the fourth wall. It makes it feel like, hey, it's literally just me and you. I'm not speaking to anyone else. I'm speaking to literally from myself to you. And by the way, I find this valuable. This is giving you some insight. You see, again, that's me breaking the fourth wall, but also making it feel a lot more intimate. So using rhetorical questions can do that. Second, inject a bit of urgency. Injecting urgency means using your voice, your tone, and your enthusiasm to make your content lively and engaging. It's about varying your delivering, being loud then being soft, being fast then being slow. This keeps your audience on their toes and excited about what you're saying. A person who does this extremely well is Emma Chamberlain. If you listen to her podcast, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're in business, this doesn't really matter. If you're a podcaster, listen to that podcast, because she does a phenomenal job of injecting energy into a podcast and making you feel like you're in the room with her. And why this works so well, it's pretty simple. If you've got shitty delivery, shitty tone, and it's like monotone, it's like reading a textbook. Yeah, it's great, but it's hard to keep focus. So it's really important that you infuse your actual energy to make it feel like turning on the lights in a dark room. It commands attention and conveys enthusiasm, which again can be super contagious. And then finally, it's not always about what you say, it's how you say it. A dull delivery can make even the most fascinating content feel boring. Whereas if you add a bit of energy and a bit of passion, it adds way more life to your message. The same way that seasoning can transform a bland dish into something delicious. And you want to do the exact same thing with your voice, with your energy, with tonality, and all the things I've mentioned above. And 4, edit out the fluff, meaning post-production, right? Everything we've said so far really is during the production of your show, when you're interviewing someone or when you're doing a solo show. But this is post-production. It's very simple. Start editing out the fluff, which essentially just means remove anything in your episode that doesn't directly contribute to the main idea. Because there are going to be certain tangents and long-winded explanation that you give, that we all give sometimes, that can just be filtered out. Your audience don't need to hear that. If it's not going to add value to their life, why should they care? So just think about it from that perspective, right? The goal is to keep the content lean, focused, and valuable. Now, why this works, well, it's pretty simple, right? If you think of fluff as essentially, weeds in a garden, it just distracts you from the beauty of the flowers. But when you remove all the relevant tangents, you ensure that listeners stay focused on the core message and value without unnecessary distractions. And really the insight here is attention spans are shorter now than ever. Now, whilst I think that this stat is pretty sus and really is just like how good the content is, can you keep people's attention? For generalities, I probably would say I would agree actually. Like attention spans probably are going down. But every second of irrelevant content risks you losing a potential listener. So by you basically cutting out the fluff, you're respecting their time, which is your audience, right? And ensuring that every single moment that you actually put out, that you share with them, serves your core message. Again, think about trimming the fat off, steak. It makes it way more appetizing for yourself, for your audience. And in terms of the product itself, the packaging is so much more impactful. And then finally, monitor listener feedback. So what is this? Monitoring listener feedback means paying attention to what your audience says about your podcast. This could include reading reviews, analyzing comments on social media, or studying your podcast analytics. It's about understanding what your listeners like and don't like so that you can make improvements. Why? Feedback is like a GPS for your podcast. It tells you what's working and where to adjust course, ensuring that you're always creating content that resonates with your audience. If you're just like ignoring people and just like you're getting really good feedback, whether it's constructive, it doesn't really matter what it is. Feedback is feedback. If you're getting that and you're not using it, you're screwing yourself over. Because at the end of the day, like even with this YouTube channel, like it's not really about me, to be honest with you. It's about you and what you want and whether or not I'm providing value to you and whether you see the value in what I'm doing. But essentially, in this game of content creation, you're the decider. If you give me feedback and I ignore that, when you're the audience and you're the person that I'm trying to serve, I'm screwing who over? I'm screwing myself. Like you're going to go to someone else who's going to provide you better content about podcasting, about growth. And the exact same thing is true for your audience. So don't ignore feedback, no matter how big or small it might be. And you might be thinking, hey, look, my podcast is super small. I'm currently not even getting any feedback. What else should I do? Well, here's the thing. You are getting feedback. So if, let's say, for example, you realize that one of your episodes blew up, right? But then the rest of them are doing terribly. They're not doing as good. That's feedback. That tells you that the topic you've covered is super interesting. It also tells you that something specific that you did in an episode captured people's attention. So review that, look at the title, look at the topic, and ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I improve on it? The other thing that you can do, and because again, you are always getting feedback, is if you look at your retention time, if you remember your retention time, completion rate, consumption rate, doesn't fucking matter. It's essentially how long on average your audience is staying hooked on your content. You can go to Apple Podcast Connect to find this out. When you look at that and you see that number, 50, 100%, whatever it might be, that tells you which episodes you've done that your audience had the highest engagement on, which means you can then create specific episodes that follow that kind of structure, number one, but also review your tonality, your energy levels, see why the hell did they stick around for so long, re-watch it, or rather re-listen to the episode and see what you did well, and then double down and try again. So again, you are getting feedback even if you have a tiny audience. And again, the insight here is your audience tells you what they need, both directly through reviews and comments, and indirectly through your analytics. Listening to this feedback is like tailoring a suit. You just adjust the fits to match their preference, ensuring it always feels like it's made for them, like it's made for you. And then finally, step number 3, retention triggers. So what are these? So retention triggers are psychological hooks that keeps your audience engaged in your content. These are the same principles that make great TV shows binge-worthy. Adapted specifically for your business podcast, right? So they create an emotional investment that makes your audience want to stick around for the entire journey. So let me show you how to use these psychological triggers to turn casual listeners into engaged prospects who can't wait to hear your next episode. Number 1, deploy open loops effectively. So start with multiple stories or different threads. I'll share how Amy doubled her client roster in just a moment. But first, let me break down what she was doing wrong. That's an open loop hook, right? The next one, tease upcoming value. Later in this episode, I'll break down the exact follow-up sequence that converted 80% of our podcast listeners into discovery calls. That again, what does it do? I'm just opening loops. These are just simple ways to open loops so that you feel like you need to stick around to the end of the episode to get the value. And then finally, mini cliffhangers. The third strategy shocked me with how well it works, but I need to cover these 2 foundational pieces first. Once again, what am I doing? I'm throwing out, I'm just opening loops for you. Think about it. Your solo episodes all of a guest. How can you constantly tease what's coming up? How can you future pace to tease what's coming up? Next one, use callback references. Now, these is very simple. All you're going to be doing is just calling back previous episodes. So you want to connect current points to the earlier story. Remember that LinkedIn template I mentioned? Here's why it works so well. You can build on a previous concept. This is exactly the mindset shift we discussed earlier, but now apply to growing podcasts, whatever that might be. And then reinforce key themes. Just like in Sarah's case, this proves that engagement isn't about X, Y, and Z. So reference points, again, you can use these callbacks and reference points through your episodes. If you're interviewing a guest, you can do the exact same thing. Oh, that's so cool. So when you mentioned at the start of the episode about this thing, this is how it applies. Great. And again, it makes your content feel effortless to consume because you're almost doing the thinking for your audience. And you you're guiding them through this process. It needs to feel effortless. And then, of course, create what we call anticipation points. So preview upcoming episodes. So next week, I'll share the advanced version of this framework. Again, what you're doing, you're creating that engagement for future content. It's not just about this one, it's about future content. You can hit a bonus content. So make sure to listen all the way until the end for a special resource that makes this implementation automatic. Again, what am I doing? I'm future pacing. Next one, plant future hooks. This is just the foundations. Wait until you see how we'll build on this in part 2. Really, when it comes to creating anticipation for the next point, you're just getting people excited for future content, whether it's in this episode or whether it's in the next episode. That's all you're doing here, just building up the anticipation that gets people excited and encourages them to look into the future, to recognize your future content so they can be way more nurtured. So look, we've covered a lot there, but here's my final message, right? Podcast isn't competing with other podcasts. It's competing with every distraction in your listener's life, which sometimes can be other podcasts. But I'm gonna go back on myself here. So make it worth choosing. Make all these changes to your podcast, add your hooks, make all these changes because it makes a massive difference to your growth, to the amount of discovery calls you book, to the amount of clients you close, to how you feel. Let's be honest, to how you feel. Let's be honest. Who wants to have a podcast with 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million listeners where the majority of the listeners aren't consuming most of the content you produce. That's basically worthless. Like, that would be horrible. That's probably a worse spot to be. I'd rather no one bloody listen than people listen, but no one actually listen. That's a terrible spot. Imagine selling out a stadium, right? You're a singer. Imagine selling out a stadium. You get up on stage, you start singing, and everyone's on their phone. No one's paying attention, and no one cares. It'll be crap. It'll be crap, right? So making these changes means you step on stage with everyone paying close attention to you, with people buzzing, excited, passing out because they can't believe they're about to watch you perform for the first time. We want to create the same experience for your episodes. So let me recap every single thing we've covered so far in this video. Podcasters lose the majority of their listeners within the first few minutes. This happens because they focus on content without considering consumption psychology. The real problem isn't content quality, it's strategic episode design. We've identified 3 critical mistakes: overwhelming listeners, unclear structure, lack of momentum. The solution starts with understanding psychological engagement triggers. This means crafting openings that hook attention instantly, then maintaining engagement through strategic content pacing. Each section should build anticipation for what's coming next. Your listeners stay engaged because they're invested in the journey. Implementation becomes straightforward with our 3-step framework. Each episode naturally creates anticipation for the next. Your content then becomes impossible to listen to later. This transforms your podcast from background noise into a must-listen content. A result, a show that listeners prioritize over other distraction. A show that drives more growth, more engagement, more opportunities your way, and a show that you're genuinely proud of because you're making an income by keeping listeners eager to hear what you have to say next, by keeping and convincing listeners to check out all your future content, by nurturing them and then converting them later on. But without high podcast engagement, if things keep the same way they are, you're going to get more of what you've got so far. So look, if you've enjoyed this video, leave a like, leave a comment. That's it for today when it comes to increasing the engagement levels on your podcast. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.